We'll add the other input power terminals as generic terminals left, since we want the input terminals to be on the left in our case. Let's rename them accordingly. Now we'll add the output power terminals as generic terminals right, since we want the output terminals on the right in our case, and rename them accordingly. The three remaining terminals are for the DC bus and the brake, which we'll add as generic terminals too. It's entirely up to you which side you want them on. We'll rename them as they appear on the drive. Now that we're done with the power terminals, let's move on to the control terminals. For this example, we'll add the terminals in the order in which they appear on the physical drive, which is shown below. First are R1 and R2, which is a relay contact. So we need to add a relay channel for that. Since this relay channel consists of two terminals, we'll hold Shift when selecting Add Relay Channel. Enter the number of terminals and click OK. Notice how both terminals belong to the same channel. Now we'll rename them as they appear on the drive, R1 and R2. The names R1 and R2 don't imply specifically what those terminals are for, so we'll add information in the label column, which will appear on the schematics. The next terminals, R5 and R6, are also a relay channel, so once again, we'll hold Shift when selecting Add Relay Channel. Again, it's two terminals for this channel. We'll name and label them similar to how we did for the previous relay channel. Next, we have a blank spot in the terminal strip, so we'll ignore that. Beside that is 01 to 08. Looking at the diagram, 01 to 03 are digital inputs, 04 is a common, then 05 to 08 are digital inputs. Although the terminals are shown grouped together on the diagram, it doesn't mean they're of the same channel. Looking at the descriptions, it's clear that each terminal can have a different function. Thus, they do not belong to the same channel. So we should not hold Shift when selecting Add Digital Inputs Channel. We will simply click the button 3 times to add 3 digital inputs, each belonging to their own channel. Now let's name them as they appear on the drive, 01 to 03. Now for the labels, 01 is Stop, so we'll enter that. The next two terminals are programmable, so it's up to you what you want to enter in the label field, if anything. We suggest entering the default function in the label field, since it is easy enough to change the label as needed once the component has been added to a project. For example, here is a similar component within a project. The default label for terminal 02 is Start, but it can easily be changed in the context of the project by double-clicking on it and changing the label value. If there was no label defined, you can still change the label by double-clicking on the name text attribute and changing the label property. Knowing all of this, we're not going to be shy about entering the default labels for the terminals. Next is 04, Digital Input Common. So we'll add a generic terminal for that. We'll name it 04 and label it DCOM. Then there are 4 programmable digital inputs. We'll rename them and simply label them DI, since they can be programmed to anything, except for 07, which we'll label Pulse, since that is its default function. After that are C1 and C2, which relate to communication. These are not communication ports themselves, though, since they are merely for Shield and Common, nor are they I/O terminals. So we'll define them as generic terminals, then name and label them. The actual communication port is not shown in this diagram, but we know it is an RJ45 port, so we'll add a communication port for that, and simply name it RJ45. Onto the second row of control terminals, we have S1 to 19. S1, S2, and S Plus relate to safe torque off, which are neither IOs nor communication ports, so we'll use generic terminals for these. Then name and label them accordingly. +11 is the plus 24 volt DC terminal, so a generic terminal is appropriate for that. 12, 13, and 14 are an analog input channel consisting of 3 terminals, but 14 is a common for other analog signals too. So we won't group 14 specifically with 12 and 13. Let's add 12 and 13 as an analog input channel with 2 terminals. Hold Shift when clicking Add Analog Input Channel. Enter 2 terminals and click OK. Then we'll name and label them. Now we'll add 14 as a generic terminal by itself, since it is a shared common between several analog I/O. Then name and label it. 15 is an analog input, so we'll add that, then name and label it. Similarly, 16 is an analog output with 1 terminal, so add, name, and label that. Terminals 17 to 19 are covered in the block generator tutorial at the 3-minute 20-second mark.